The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that echoed through the packed auction house in Cheyenne, Wyoming. What happened next would shake the foundations of the American West and challenge everything people thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the true meaning of wealth. When millionaire cattle baron Marcus Thornfield raised his hand one final time, he wasn't just buying property. He was about to change 6 lives forever in ways that would leave an entire community speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th, 1887, dawned cold and unforgiving over the rolling plains of Wyoming Territory. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an omen, casting long shadows across the weathered buildings of Cheyenne. Inside the cramped quarters of the Grand Union Hotel, the Garrett family huddled together in their final hours of freedom, unaware that their lives were about to intersect with one of the most powerful men in the territory. Thomas Garrett sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his calloused hands trembling as he held a letter that arrived 3 days earlier. The paper bore the official seal of the Wyoming Territorial Court, and its contents had drained the color from his weathered face. At 42, Thomas had spent his entire adult life working the land, first as a farmhand in Nebraska, then as a homesteader trying to carve out a living in the harsh Wyoming wilderness. His wife Elizabeth, 38 and still beautiful despite the hardships that had aged her beyond her years, sat beside him with their youngest daughter Emma clutched protectively in her arms, the other children Samuel, 16 and already showing the broad shoulders of his father, Mary, 14 with her mother's gentle eyes, twins Jacob and Joshua, both 12 and still clinging to the innocence of childhood occupied every available space in the tiny room. They had been living in this hotel for 2 weeks, ever since the bank had foreclosed on their homestead 60 miles north of town. Everything they owned in the world was contained in 3 battered trunks and a canvas bag that held Elizabeth's sewing supplies. The drought had been merciless that summer. For 3 consecutive years, the rains had failed to come when needed, and the winter snows had been too light to replenish the groundwater. Thomas had watched helplessly as his crops withered in the fields, his small herd of cattle grew thin and weak, and his savings dwindled to nothing. He had borrowed against the land, then borrowed again, always believing that the next season would bring better fortune. But fortune, it seemed, had turned its back on the Garrett family. The letter in Thomas's hands was a summons to appear at the territorial courthouse for the settlement of his debts. Under the harsh laws of the territory, a man's unpaid obligations could result in indentured servitude, a practice that, while officially discouraged, was still legally permissible for families who had exhausted all other means of payment. The Garretts owed nearly $800 to various creditors, a sum that might as well have been $8,000 for all their ability to pay it. Elizabeth shifted Emma to her other arm and placed a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder. "There has to be another way," she whispered, though her voice carried little conviction. They had already explored every option, selling what few possessions they had, seeking work in town, even considering the dangerous prospect of heading further west to the gold fields of Montana. But winter was approaching. They had 4 children to feed and shelter, and opportunities for work were scarce in a territory where every able-bodied man was already struggling to survive. Samuel, the eldest, had been unusually quiet since learning of their situation. Unlike his younger siblings, he understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Indentured servitude meant the family would be separated, likely sold to different masters across the territory. He had heard stories from other families who had faced similar circumstances, children torn from their parents, husbands and wives never seeing each other again, years of backbreaking labor with no hope of freedom until their debts were satisfied. "Pa," Samuel said quietly, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over the room, "maybe I could find work at one of the big ranches." I'm strong enough to do a man's work, and if I could send money, Thomas shook his head firmly. We stay together as a family, son. Whatever happens, we face it together. But even as he spoke these words, Thomas knew the cruel reality of their situation. The territorial laws made no provision for keeping families intact during debt servitude. The Garretts would be auctioned off like livestock, sold to whoever was willing to pay their debts in exchange for their labor. The process was designed to be efficient, not humane. 3 blocks away from the hotel, in the most opulent mansion in Cheyenne, Marcus Thornfield stood before a massive window that overlooked the town's main thoroughfare. At 55, he cut. An imposing figure, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through whatever they focused upon. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of hard work, now bore expensive rings that caught the morning light. The simple rancher's clothing of his younger days had been replaced by tailored suits and polished boots, but there was still something untamed about him, something that spoke of the frontier and the fierce independence required to survive in this harsh land. Thornfield had arrived in Wyoming Territory 28 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and an unshakable determination to build something lasting. He had started with a small plot of land and a handful of cattle, working 18-hour days, sleeping under the stars, and fighting off both natural predators and human ones who sought to take what little he had. Through a combination of shrewd business sense, unwavering persistence, and what some called ruthless ambition, he had built the largest cattle operation in the territory. The Thornfield Ranch now sprawled across nearly 200,000 acres, employing over 300 men and running upwards of 50,000 head of cattle. His herds grazed on land that stretched from the Colorado border to the Montana line, and his beef fed families as far away as Chicago and New York. The railroad companies courted his business, politicians sought his endorsement, and bankers competed for the privilege of handling his accounts. But success, Thornfield had learned, was a double-edged sword. The higher a man climbed, the more clearly he could see the suffering of those below. And lately, he had been seeing a great deal of suffering indeed. The drought that had devastated the Garrett family was only one example of the hardships plaguing the territory. Dozens of smaller ranchers and homesteaders had been forced off their land, their dreams crushed by circumstances beyond their control. Many had simply packed up and left, heading back east or further west in search of better opportunities. Others, like the Garretts, had exhausted their resources and found themselves trapped by debt and desperation. Thornfield's butler, a distinguished man named Harrison who had followed him west from his brief stint in San Francisco society, entered the study carrying a silver tray with the morning's correspondence. Among the usual business letters and social invitations was a notice from the territorial court about the day's debt auction. Such notices were routinely sent to prominent citizens who might have need of additional labor for their operations. "Sir," Harrison said, setting down the tray, "your foreman, Mr. Dalton, is here to see you. He says it's urgent." Thornfield nodded and gestured for the man to be shown in. James Dalton had been with him for 15 years, starting as a common cowhand, and working his way up to become the most trusted man on the ranch. If Dalton said something was urgent, it was worth hearing. Dalton entered the study, his hat in his hands and concern etched across his weathered features. "Boss, we've got a problem. Lost another 12 head to rustlers last night, up near the north pasture. That makes 43 this month." Thornfield frowned. Cattle rustling had always been a problem in the territory, but lately it seemed to be getting worse. "Any tracks? Any idea who's responsible?" "Same as before, professionals. Not desperate homesteaders. They know what they're doing, and they're hitting us systematic-like. Johnson thinks it might be the Blackwood gang out of Colorado, but I'm not so sure. This feels more organized than their usual work." The Blackwood gang was a notorious group of outlaws who had been terrorizing ranchers across Colorado and Wyoming for the past 2 years. Led by a former Confederate officer named Silas Blackwood, they specialized in large-scale cattle theft, often driving stolen herds hundreds of miles to sell at railroad towns where questions weren't asked. But Dalton was right. This recent pattern of thefts felt different, more calculated. Double the patrols on the northern boundary, Thornfield instructed, and send word to Sheriff Morrison in town. If this is the Blackwood gang, we'll need coordination with the other ranchers to stop them. Dalton nodded and turned to leave, but Thornfield called him back. Jim, what do you know about the debt auction today? The foreman's expression darkened. Heard there's a family of 6 going up. Homesteaders from up north who lost everything. In the drought, word is they owe near $800. A family of 6, Thornfield repeated thoughtfully. Children? 4 of them, from what I hear. Youngest is just a baby. Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the town below. He had attended debt auctions before, though never as a buyer. The practice left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he recognized it as a necessary evil in a territory where formal banking and legal systems were still developing. Still, the thought of a family being broken apart, children separated from their parents, struck him as fundamentally wrong. Sir? Dalton prompted, uncertain about his employer's sudden silence. Nothing, Jim, just thinking. You go ahead and take care of those patrols. After Dalton left, Thornfield found himself unable to concentrate on his correspondence. The notice from the territorial court lay open on his desk, and he found his eyes drawn to it repeatedly. A family of 6, 4 children. $800, a sum that represented years of backbreaking labor for a homesteader, but barely a week's profit from his cattle operation. Stopped by mid-morning, word of the debt auction had spread throughout Cheyenne. Such events always drew crowds, though the motivations varied widely. Some came looking for cheap labor, others out of morbid curiosity, and still others hoping to find family members who had been separated by previous auctions. The courthouse steps began filling with a diverse mix of ranchers, businessmen, and townsfolk, all waiting for the proceedings to begin. Thomas Garrett led his family through the crowded streets toward the courthouse, their few possessions carried in the arms of the older children. Elizabeth walked beside him, Emma still clutched protectively against her chest, while the other children followed in a tight group behind their parents. The looks they received from passers-by ranged from sympathetic to coldly calculating, as potential buyers sized them up like livestock at a cattle market. The courthouse itself was a 2-story brick building that served as the center of territorial government for the region. Its steps were wide and imposing, designed to project authority and permanence in a land where both were often in short supply. A temporary platform had been erected on the steps, complete with a podium and gavel for the auctioneer. Benches had been arranged in rough rows for the audience, though many preferred to stand at the back where they could leave quickly if needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Judge William Harrington, a stern man in his 60s who had presided over the territorial court for nearly a decade, took his place at the podium promptly at noon. He was known for his fairness, but also for his strict adherence to the law, regardless of personal feelings about its consequences. Beside him stood the court clerk, a nervous young man named Peter Williams who kept detailed records of all proceedings, and the territorial marshal, whose job was to maintain order and ensure that the terms of any agreements were understood by all parties. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Harrington began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. We are here today to conduct the lawful settlement of debts in accordance with the laws of Wyoming Territory. The family of Thomas Garrett, consisting of 6 individuals, has appeared before this court with total outstanding debts in the amount of $783.47. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a substantial sum, more than many men earned in 2 years of steady work. Thomas felt Elizabeth's hand slip into his, her fingers cold despite the mild temperature. The terms of settlement are as follows, the judge continued. Any individual or individuals willing to assume the full amount of the debt may take possession of the family's labor for a period not to exceed 7 years, or until such time as the debt is satisfied through their work. The family may be kept, together or divided as the purchaser sees fit, in accordance with territorial law. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of failure crushing down upon him. 7 years of servitude, with no guarantee that his family would remain intact. His children would grow up as indentured servants, his wife would age under the burden of another man's demands, and he would spend the prime years of his life working to pay off debts that had accumulated through no fault of his own. Judge Harrington raised his gavel. Do I hear any offers for the assumption of this debt? The silence stretched out for several seconds that felt like hours. Thomas began to hope that perhaps no one would bid, that they would be given more time to find another solution. But then a voice called out from the middle of the crowd. $400. Thomas turned to see a heavy-set man in an expensive coat raising his hand. He recognized him as Herbert Sinclair, owner of one of the larger general stores in town, and known for his harsh treatment of employees. The thought of his family working for Sinclair filled Thomas with dread. $400, Judge Harrington repeated. Do I hear 500? Another voice, this one from a rancher Thomas didn't recognize. 500. 600. Called yet another bidder. The auction proceeded with businesslike efficiency, the price climbing steadily as various ranchers and businessmen competed for what they saw as a valuable source of labor. Thomas watched in growing horror as his family's fate was decided by men who saw them as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The bidding slowed as it approached the $700 mark. Only 2 bidders remained active: Sinclair and a rancher named Morrison, who owned a spread south of town. Both men were known for working their employees hard, and Thomas felt his heart sinking as he realized there would be no rescue, no last-minute reprieve. $750, Morrison called out, his voice confident. Sinclair hesitated, clearly calculating whether the family's potential labor was worth the additional investment. The silence stretched out as he considered his options. Judge Harrington raised his gavel. $750, going once. $800. The voice came from the back of the crowd, clear and authoritative. Every head turned to see who had made the bid that would satisfy the full debt amount. Thomas strained to see over the crowd and finally caught sight of a tall, well-dressed man standing near the courthouse wall. Marcus Thornfield stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. Conversations stopped, and even Judge Harrington seemed momentarily taken aback by the appearance of the territory's most prominent citizen at a debt auction. Mr. Thornfield, the judge said, recovering his composure, you bid $800 for the assumption of the Garrett family's debt? I do, Your Honor. $800 to be paid in full immediately upon completion of the legal proceedings. The crowd buzzed with surprise and speculation. Marcus Thornfield was known to employ hundreds of men on his ranch, but he had never participated in a debt auction before. Some whispered that he must have urgent need for additional workers, perhaps due to the recent cattle thefts. Others wondered if there was some personal connection between Thornfield and the Garrett family. Judge Harrington looked around the crowd one final time. $800, going once. Going twice. He brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to Marcus Thornfield for $800. Thomas felt his knees go weak. Of all the possible outcomes, being sold to Marcus Thornfield was perhaps the least terrible. The man had a reputation for treating his employees fairly, and his ranch was large enough that the family might be allowed to stay together. But they were still indentured servants now, their freedom gone for years to come. Thornfield approached the platform where the Garrett family stood, his expression unreadable. He studied each of them in turn: Thomas, with his defeated posture and work-worn hands; Elizabeth clutching baby Emma with desperate protectiveness; the four older children, ranging from Samuel's premature maturity to the twins' frightened confusion. "Mr. Garrett," Thornfield said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. "I am Marcus Thornfield. You and your family will be coming with me." Thomas nodded, unable to trust his voice. He had expected this moment to feel like the final nail in the coffin of his dreams, but something in Thornfield's manner suggested that perhaps their ordeal was not quite what it seemed. The legal formalities were completed quickly. Thornfield produced a bank draft for the full amount, which was verified and accepted by the court. The debt was officially transferred, and the Garrett family became the legal responsibility of Marcus Thornfield for a period not to exceed 7 years. As the crowd began to disperse, many lingering to discuss this unexpected turn of events, Thornfield gestured for the Garretts to follow him. A large wagon waited at the edge of the courthouse square, driven by a man Thomas recognized as James Dalton, Thornfield's foreman. Their few possessions were loaded into the back, and the family climbed aboard for the journey to their new life. Ride to the Thornfield Ranch took nearly 2 hours, winding through some of the most beautiful country Thomas had ever seen. Rolling hills covered with prairie grass stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of cottonwood and aspen that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. Herds of cattle dotted the landscape, fat and healthy despite the drought that had devastated smaller operations. Throughout the journey, Thornfield remained largely silent, occasionally pointing out landmarks or asking brief questions about the family's background. He seemed particularly interested in Samuel's experience with livestock and Thomas's knowledge of farming techniques. Elizabeth, meanwhile, tried to keep the younger children calm and quiet, though Emma had begun to fuss from hunger and the discomfort of the long wagon ride. As they topped a rise and the Thornfield Ranch came into view, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The main house was a sprawling 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with wide porches and large windows that spoke of comfort and permanence. Outbuildings stretched in all directions: barns, bunkhouses, workshops, and corrals that seemed to go on forever. It was more prosperous than anything Thomas had imagined, a testament to what could be achieved in this harsh land with enough determination and resources. But what struck him most was not the evidence of wealth, but the signs of care and attention to detail. The buildings were well maintained, the grounds were neat and orderly, and the workers they passed seemed relaxed and content rather than driven by fear or desperation. Whatever else Marcus Thornfield might be, he appeared to be a fair and competent manager of both land and people. The wagon pulled up in front of the main house, and Thornfield jumped down with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. "Mrs. Garrett," he said, offering his hand to help Elizabeth down from the wagon, "I imagine you and the children are tired and hungry. My housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, will see that you're fed and given a place to rest." As if summoned by his words, a plump, middle-aged woman emerged from the house, her face kind but businesslike. She looked over the family with practiced eyes, immediately taking charge of the situation. "Come along, dear," she said to Elizabeth, her voice warm with a slight Irish accent. "Let's get you and the little one settled. There's fresh bread in the kitchen and stew still warm on the stove." As Mrs. Patterson led Elizabeth and the younger children toward the house, Thornfield turned to Thomas and Samuel. "Gentlemen, if you would accompany me to my study, there are some matters we need to discuss." Thomas felt a chill of apprehension. This was the moment when the terms of their servitude would be made clear, when they would learn exactly what was expected of them and what their lives would be like for the next 7 years. He placed a protective hand on Samuel's shoulder and followed Thornfield into the house. The study was a comfortable room, lined with books and furnished with leather chairs and a massive oak desk. Maps of the territory covered one wall, marked with boundaries and cattle trails, while the opposite wall was decorated with paintings of western landscapes and wildlife. It was the room of an educated man, someone who had succeeded not just through physical strength, but through intelligence and planning. Thornfield gestured for them to sit, then moved to a sideboard where he poured 3 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher. He handed one to each of them before taking his own seat behind the desk. "Mr. Garrett," he began, his tone serious but not unkind, "I want you to understand exactly what has happened today and what it means for you and your family." Thomas nodded, bracing himself for the worst. "According to the law, you and your family are now indentured to me for a period not to exceed 7 years, or until your debt of $800 is satisfied through your labor. The law gives me considerable authority over your lives during this period, where you live, what work you do, even whether your family remains together." The words hit Thomas like physical blows, each one a reminder of how completely he had failed to protect those he loved most. But then Thornfield leaned forward, his expression changing in a way that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. "However, Mr. Garrett, I want you to know that I have no intention of exercising most of those legal rights. Your family will remain together, you will be treated with dignity and respect, and you will be compensated fairly for your work." Thomas blinked, certain he had misheard. "Compensated, sir?" "Indeed. While the law does not require me to pay indentured servants, I believe that honest work deserves honest wages. You will receive room and board for your entire family, plus a monthly wage that will be credited against your debt. At the current rate, I estimate your obligation will be satisfied in approximately 3 years rather than 7. Samuel leaned forward in his chair, his young face filled with hope and confusion. "Sir, I don't understand. Why would you do that?" Thornfield was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Because, young man, I believe that circumstances should not determine a person's worth. Your father's debt was incurred through no fault of his own. Drought and economic hardship are forces beyond any individual's control. It would be unconscionable for me to profit from your family's misfortune." Thomas felt tears stinging his eyes, the first real hope he had experienced in months threatening to overwhelm him. "Mr. Thornfield, we don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Thornfield replied with a slight smile. "You haven't heard about the work I have in mind for you." The work Marcus Thornfield had in mind was unlike anything Thomas Garrett had expected. Over the following weeks, as autumn settled across the Wyoming territory and the aspen trees turned brilliant gold against the darkening sky, Thomas found himself thrust into a world that challenged everything he thought he knew about ranching, business, and the complex relationships between men in the untamed West. Rather than assigning the Garrett family to traditional ranch labor, mucking stables, mending fences, or herding cattle, Thornfield had something far more unusual in mind. On their 3rd morning at the ranch, he summoned Thomas to his study where detailed maps were spread across every available surface. These weren't the typical territorial surveys Thomas had seen before, but intricate charts showing cattle movements, water sources, grazing patterns, and most intriguingly, a complex network of routes marked in red ink that seemed to crisscross the entire region. "Mr. Garrett," Thornfield began, pointing to a section of the map that covered the northern reaches of his property, "I understand you have experience reading land, understanding water flow, soil quality, the subtle signs that indicate where livestock will naturally congregate." Thomas nodded cautiously. During his years as a homesteader, he had developed an almost intuitive sense for reading the landscape, knowing where to dig for water, which areas would support crops, and how weather patterns affected the movement of both wild and domestic animals. It was a skill born of necessity, honed by years of struggle to make the land produce enough to support his family. "What I'm about to show you," Thornfield continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Must remain absolutely confidential. Not even my most trusted employees are aware of the full scope of what I'm dealing with." He rolled out another map, this one showing cattle theft patterns across a 3-state region. Red pins marked locations where livestock had been stolen, with dates and estimated numbers written in Thornfield's precise handwriting. Blue pins indicated where stolen cattle had been recovered or sold, creating a web of criminal activity that stretched from Colorado to Montana. "The Blackwood Gang," Thomas said, recognizing the pattern immediately. "Not just the Blackwood Gang," Thornfield corrected. "That's what we thought initially, but the pattern is too sophisticated, too well coordinated. Someone with inside knowledge of ranching operations is feeding information to multiple criminal organizations. They know which herbs to target, when ranchers will be moving cattle, where the most valuable animals are located." Thomas studied the map more carefully, his farmer's eye picking up subtleties that might escape a casual observer. The theft locations weren't random, they followed specific geographic features, utilizing natural corridors and water sources that would allow rustlers to move stolen cattle quickly and efficiently. "You think there's a traitor among the ranchers themselves," Thomas said, the implications becoming clear. "I'm certain of it. Someone with access to information from multiple ranches. Someone who understands the business well enough to maximize profits while minimizing risk. The question is who?" Thornfield moved to another section of the map, this one showing his own property in extraordinary detail. Every building, every fence line, every water source was marked with military precision. But what caught Thomas's attention were the small notations scattered across the property: observations about employee behavior, suspicious activities, unexplained absences. "This is where you come in, Mr. Garrett. As a new arrival, you can move around the ranch without arousing suspicion. Your background as a homesteader gives you credibility with the working men, and your family situation ensures that no one will suspect you of having ulterior motives." Thomas felt a chill of understanding. "You want me to spy on your own employees. I want you to help me identify a traitor who is costing not just me, but dozens of honest ranchers across the territory their livelihoods. Men like yourself who came west seeking opportunity and found only hardship made worse by criminal activity." The moral complexity of the situation wasn't lost on Thomas. He owed Thornfield an enormous debt, not just the financial obligation that had brought him here, but gratitude for the man's unexpected kindness to his family. Yet the idea of betraying the trust of working men who might be facing their own desperate circumstances, troubled him deeply. As if reading his thoughts, Thornfield continued, "I'm not asking you to manufacture evidence or betray innocent men. I'm asking you to observe, to listen, to help me understand what's happening on my own property. If there is a traitor among my employees, he's not just stealing from me. He's stealing from every honest working man whose wages depend on the success of this operation." Over the next several days, Thomas began his unusual assignment. He was given work that allowed him to move freely around the ranch, repairing equipment, checking on remote water sources, assisting with various projects that brought him into contact with employees at every level of the operation. Samuel, meanwhile, was assigned to work with the younger cowboys, learning the skills that would serve him well in the West while also providing another set of eyes and ears. What Thomas discovered during those first weeks was a ranch operation of almost unimaginable complexity and efficiency. Thornfield employed not just cowboys and ranch hands, but also craftsmen, accountants, veterinarians, and even a telegraph operator who maintained communication with cattle buyers as far away as Chicago. The ranch was less like a traditional cattle operation and more like a small city, complete with its own economy, social hierarchy, and intricate web of relationships. The bunkhouses where the single men lived were comfortable and well maintained, with individual bunks, adequate heating, and even a small library stocked with books and newspapers. Married employees lived in neat cottages scattered across the property, each with its own garden plot and chicken coop. The wages were fair, the food was good, and Thornfield's reputation for treating his workers well was clearly deserved. Yet beneath this apparent harmony, Thomas began to detect subtle tensions and undercurrents that suggested all was not as peaceful as it appeared. Certain employees seemed nervous around management, while others displayed a confidence that bordered on arrogance. There were whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when supervisors appeared, and an atmosphere of suspicion that seemed to permeate certain segments of the workforce. The Garrett family had been assigned a comfortable cottage near the ranch's main residential area, close enough to the other families to feel part of the community, but far enough from the bunkhouses to maintain some privacy. Elizabeth had quickly established herself as a valuable member of the ranch's domestic staff, her skills with needle and thread making her indispensable for mending clothes and creating new garments for the growing number of employees' children. Mary and the twins had been enrolled in the ranch's small schoolhouse, where they joined the children of other employees in lessons taught by Miss Sarah Coleman, a young woman from Boston whose family had sent her west for her health. Emma, now walking and chattering constantly, had become the unofficial mascot of the domestic staff, her cheerful presence brightening even the most mundane tasks. It was Samuel, however, who provided the first real breakthrough in Thomas's investigation. Working alongside the younger cowboys, he had developed friendships that allowed him access to conversations and observations that might have been hidden from adult scrutiny. One evening, as the family gathered for their simple dinner, Samuel reported something that immediately caught his father's attention. "Pa," Samuel said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "there's something strange going on with some of the night riders." Night riders were the cowboys assigned to patrol the ranch's boundaries during the dark hours, watching for predators, rustlers, and other threats to the livestock. It was dangerous, lonely work that attracted a particular type of man, those comfortable with solitude and capable of making quick decisions in potentially deadly situations. "What kind of strange?" Thomas asked. "Well, you know Jake Morrison, the one with the scar on his face? He's been coming back from his patrols with information that doesn't make sense. Last week, he reported seeing strangers near the northern boundary, but when Mr. Dalton sent a crew to investigate, there were no tracks, no signs that anyone had been there." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What else?" "And there's Ben Sawyer. He's been receiving letters from town, but he can't read. When I asked him about it, he got real nervous and said they were from his sister back in Kansas. But Charlie Henderson told me Ben's whole family died in a cholera outbreak 3 years ago." These were exactly the kinds of inconsistencies that might indicate criminal activity. Men passing false information, maintaining mysterious correspondences, displaying knowledge or resources inconsistent with their stated backgrounds, all potential signs of involvement in the cattle theft ring. That night, Thomas made his way to Thornfield's study to report Samuel's observations. He found the rancher poring over financial ledgers, his face grim in the lamplight. The past month's losses to rustlers had been particularly severe, with nearly 100 heads of prime cattle stolen in 3 separate incidents. "Mr. Thornfield," Thomas began, then related Samuel's information about the suspicious activities of Morrison and Sawyer. Thornfield listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When Thomas finished, the rancher leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Jake Morrison has been with me for 6 years, he said finally. "He came highly recommended from a ranch in Colorado, good references, solid work record. Ben Sawyer is newer, maybe 18 months. He drifted in looking for work and seemed competent enough." "Sometimes the best references can be fabricated," Thomas suggested. "And 6 years would be long enough to establish trust before beginning criminal activities." Thornfield nodded slowly. "I've been thinking along similar lines. The timing of the increased thefts coincides roughly with several new hires, but it also coincides with changes in the territorial economy that might have motivated previously honest men to turn to crime. The territorial economy had indeed been under severe strain. The harsh winters and dry summers of recent years had bankrupted numerous smaller operations, creating a population of displaced cowboys and ranch hands who might be susceptible to criminal recruitment. At the same time, the growing demand for beef in eastern cities had made cattle theft increasingly profitable, with stolen livestock able to command premium prices if transported far enough from their point of origin. "There's something else," Thomas said, producing a piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "I found this near the northern fence line yesterday. It might be nothing, but ... The paper was a fragment of what appeared to be a map showing a section of terrain that Thomas recognized as part of Thornfield's property. But the markings on it were unusual symbols and notations that didn't correspond to typical ranch documentation. Thornfield examined the fragment carefully, holding it up to the lamp to study the details. "This is interesting. These markings look like they might indicate specific dates and numbers, possibly scheduling information for planned thefts." "That's what I thought. The terrain shown matches the area where we lost those 30 head last week." "Where exactly did you find this?" "About a quarter-mile north of the main water tank, caught on a sagebrush. It looked like it had been there for several days, maybe blown by the wind from somewhere else." Thornfield stood and moved to his wall map, locating the area Thomas described. "That's directly on the route Jake Morrison would take during his northern patrol. And it's also near one of the line shacks where night riders sometimes shelter during bad weather." The line shacks were small, basic structures scattered across the ranch's vast expanse, providing minimal shelter for cowboys who might be caught far from the main buildings by sudden weather changes. They were stocked with emergency supplies and basic tools, but were otherwise left unattended for long periods. "I think it's time we took a closer look at Mr. Morrison's activities," Thornfield said. "But we need to be careful. If he is involved with the rustlers, he's probably not working alone, and alerting him to our suspicions could put both our investigation and our safety at risk." The next phase of the investigation required more sophisticated planning. Thornfield couldn't simply confront Morrison or search his personal belongings without concrete evidence, as such actions would likely alert other potential conspirators and might result in legal complications if the suspicions proved unfounded. Instead, they decided on a more subtle approach. Thomas would be assigned to work on fence repairs in the northern section of the ranch, giving him a legitimate reason to be in the area during Morrison's patrol times. Samuel would continue his work with the younger cowboys, maintaining his friendships while listening for any additional suspicious information. Meanwhile, Thornfield would begin a careful review of employment records, looking for patterns or connections that might reveal the scope of the criminal network. The plan went into effect immediately. Thomas found himself spending long days in the remote northern sections of the ranch, ostensibly repairing fence lines, but actually conducting careful surveillance of the area. He noted the movements of all employees who had legitimate reasons to be in the region, mapped the locations of line shacks and other structures that might serve as meeting places or hiding spots, and began to develop a detailed understanding of the terrain that rustlers would need to cross to move stolen cattle off the property. What he discovered was both more complex and more disturbing than he had anticipated. The northern boundary of the Thornfield Ranch was far from the isolated wilderness it appeared to be. Hidden valleys and draws provided natural corridors for moving livestock, while a network of old mining roads and game trails offered multiple routes for accessing the property without detection. Several of the line shacks showed signs of recent use that couldn't be accounted for by legitimate ranch activities: fresh horse tracks, food scraps, even crude maps scratched into the wooden walls. Most significantly, Thomas discovered evidence of a sophisticated communication system Messages were being left in predetermined locations, using a simple but effective code that allowed conspirators to coordinate their activities without direct contact. Rocks arranged in specific patterns, marks carved into fence posts, even the positioning of tools in the line shacks, all served as a means of passing information about cattle movements, security arrangements, and planned thefts. The scope of the operation was staggering. This wasn't the work of a few desperate men stealing cattle to feed their families, but a well-organized criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple ranches across the territory. The rustlers had inside information about everything from shipping schedules to payroll deliveries, allowing them to maximize their profits while minimizing their risks. As Thomas compiled his evidence, he began to understand why the cattle theft problem had become so severe across the region. The criminals weren't just stealing livestock, they were stealing information, corrupting trusted employees, and undermining the very foundations of trust that made large-scale ranching operations possible. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that Jake Morrison, while certainly involved in the criminal network, was likely not its mastermind. The sophistication of the operation, the careful planning evident in every aspect of its execution, suggested someone with far more education and business experience than a typical cowboy would possess. Someone who understood not just the practical aspects of cattle theft, but the broader economic and logistical challenges of moving stolen livestock across vast distances and converting them into cash. Someone who might be much closer to Marcus Thornfield than anyone suspected. The investigation had revealed the existence of a criminal conspiracy that threatened not just individual ranchers, but the entire economic foundation of the Wyoming Territory. As Thomas prepared to present his findings to Thornfield, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that would shock the entire community and place his own family in considerable danger. The evening Thomas chose to make his report was unseasonably warm for late October, with a blood-red sunset painting the western sky in ominous shades that seemed to foreshadow the revelations to come. As he walked across the ranch compound toward Thornfield's study, Thomas noticed unusual activity around the main buildings, extra guards, hushed conversations among the supervisory staff, and an atmosphere of tension that suggested something significant was about to happen. What Thomas didn't know was that Marcus Thornfield had been conducting his own investigation, following leads that had taken him in directions far more dangerous than anything Thomas had discovered. The truth about the cattle theft ring was about to be revealed, but it would come with consequences that none of them could have anticipated. The truth began to unravel on a frigid November morning when Marcus Thornfield received an unexpected visitor at dawn. Thomas was just beginning his daily reconnaissance of the northern boundary when he spotted a lone rider approaching the main house at a pace that suggested urgent business. The man was travel-worn and dusty, his horse lathered from hard riding, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to danger. The visitor was Deputy U.S. Marshal William Crawford, a legendary figure in territorial law enforcement, who had tracked criminals across 3 states and was known for his methodical approach to solving complex cases. Crawford's arrival at the Thornfield Ranch with significant federal marshals didn't make social calls, and their involvement typically meant that local crimes had crossed state lines or involved federal jurisdiction. Crawford had been following the cattle theft ring for 8 months, tracking stolen herds from Wyoming to railroad yards in Kansas and Nebraska, where they were sold to unwitting buyers. His investigation had revealed a criminal organization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, with connections that reached into the highest levels of territorial society. What Crawford told Thornfield in the privacy of his study would have shocked anyone familiar with the ranch's operations. The mastermind behind the cattle theft ring wasn't a disgruntled cowboy or desperate homesteader, but rather someone with intimate knowledge of banking, transportation, and territorial politics. Someone who had used legitimate business connections to create an illegal empire that stretched across the entire region. That someone was Harrison Blackwell, a prominent businessman who owned banks in 3 territorial capitals and had financial interests in railroad construction, mining operations, and land speculation. Blackwell had been using his banking connections to identify vulnerable ranchers, his railroad contacts to arrange transportation for stolen cattle, and his political influence to ensure that investigations were misdirected or abandoned. But most shocking of all was Blackwell's connection to the Thornfield Ranch itself. He was one of Thornfield's oldest business associates, a man who had helped finance the ranch's expansion and who had access to detailed information about cattle movements, security arrangements, and financial operations. He had been using that access to orchestrate thefts that would damage his competitors while ensuring his own criminal enterprise remained profitable. "The evidence is overwhelming," Crawford explained to Thornfield as Thomas waited outside the study door, having been summoned to hear the marshal's revelations. "We've traced stolen cattle from your ranch and 5 others directly to buyers arranged through Blackwell's network. The thieves were being paid through drafts drawn on his banks, and the transportation was arranged through railroad officials under his influence." Thornfield's face had gone pale as the implications became clear. "Harrison has been to dinner at this house dozens of times. He's met my employees, toured my facilities, reviewed my business records, and used every bit of that information to steal from you and others," Crawford confirmed. "But that's not the worst of it. Blackwell has become desperate. Our investigation has gotten too close, and he's planning something that will eliminate the evidence and remove the witnesses who could testify against him." The marshal's words sent a chill through the room. Thomas felt his stomach drop as he realized the danger his family might be in. If Blackwell was desperate enough to eliminate witnesses, anyone connected to the investigation could become a target. Crawford continued, "We have reliable information that Blackwell plans to stage a massive raid on your ranch within the next few days. He'll make it look like an attack by the Blackwood Gang, but the real purpose will be to steal your remaining cattle, destroy your records, and eliminate anyone who might have discovered his involvement." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. A raid by the notorious Blackwood Gang would be believable, even expected given the recent increase in criminal activity. If the attack was violent enough and destructive enough, it would provide cover for eliminating specific individuals while making their deaths appear to be random casualties of frontier violence. "Who else knows about this?" Thornfield asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You, me, and now Mr. Garrett here," Crawford replied, glancing at Thomas. "We've kept the circle of information small to prevent leaks, but that also means we have limited resources to defend against the attack." Thomas stepped forward, his farmer's practicality overcoming his fear. "How many men is Blackwell likely to bring?" "Our intelligence suggests between 20 and 30 riders, all experienced gunmen recruited from criminal organizations across 3 states. They'll be well armed and prepared for resistance." The odds were daunting. Thornfield employed over 300 men, but most were cowboys and ranch hands, not gunfighters. While many had military experience and were skilled with firearms, they weren't prepared for the kind of coordinated assault that Blackwell was planning. "There's something else," Crawford added grimly. "Blackwell has inside help on your ranch. The raid will be coordinated with information provided by employees who are working for him." This confirmed Thomas's suspicions about Jake Morrison and Ben Sawyer, but it also suggested that the conspiracy reached even deeper into the ranch's operations. Blackwell's network of informants and accomplices had been cultivating their positions for years, building trust and gaining access to sensitive information. Over the next 2 days, a desperate plan began to take shape. Rather than simply trying to defend against the attack, they would turn it into a trap. Crawford had brought 6 experienced deputies with him, skilled men who had fought in both Indian wars and criminal conflicts. Combined with carefully selected ranch employees who could be trusted absolutely, they would create a defensive strategy. That might allow them to capture not just the raiders, but the evidence needed to bring down Blackwell's entire organization. The plan required precise timing and careful coordination. Most of the ranch's employees would be moved to safety before the attack, ostensibly for routine cattle drives and maintenance work in distant sections of the property. Only those involved in the defensive strategy would remain, along with a few trusted individuals who would serve as apparent targets while actually being protected by hidden defenders. Thomas found himself playing a crucial role in the deception. His investigation had given him detailed knowledge of the ranch's layout and the likely approaches the raiders would use. He would serve as a spotter, positioned where he could observe the attack's development and provide intelligence to the defenders. But the most dangerous part of the plan involved his family. Elizabeth and the children would remain in their cottage, serving as apparent civilian targets that would draw the raiders into predetermined killing zones. The risk was enormous. If the defensive plan failed, they would be completely vulnerable to armed criminals who had no qualms about murdering innocent people. "I can't ask you to put your family in that kind of danger," Thornfield said when the plan was first proposed. Thomas looked at his wife, seeing the fear in her eyes but also the determination that had carried her through years of hardship on the frontier. "Elizabeth, what do you think?" "I think," she said quietly, "that running away won't solve this problem. If we don't stop these men here, they'll just keep destroying lives until someone else has the courage to make a stand." Samuel, now fully aware of the situation, spoke up with a maturity that reminded Thomas how quickly boys became men on the frontier. "Pa, I can handle a rifle as well as most of the cowboys. Let me help with the defense." The night before the expected attack, Thomas walked the perimeter of the ranch compound one final time, checking the positions where defenders would be concealed and reviewing the signals that would coordinate their response. The November air was sharp and cold, with a clarity that made every sound carry farther than usual. In the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs, while closer to the buildings, horses stamped restlessly in their corrals, as if sensing the tension that gripped the human inhabitants. The defensive positions had been carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire while providing maximum protection for the defenders. The main house would serve as a fortress, its stone construction offering protection against small arms fire, while its elevated position provided excellent visibility of the surrounding area. The bunkhouses and barns had been reinforced with additional barriers, creating strong points that could channel attackers into predetermined zones. Crawford's deputies had positioned themselves at key locations around the compound, each armed with the latest repeating rifles and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged fight. The selected ranch employees were distributed among these positions, providing local knowledge and additional firepower. Most importantly, several defenders were hidden in locations that appeared undefended, ready to strike at attackers who thought they had found easy targets. The plan also included provisions for protecting the ranch's most valuable resources. The prize breeding bulls had been moved to secure locations, along with the breeding mares and other livestock that represented years of careful investment. Important documents and financial records had been secured in a hidden vault beneath the main house, ensuring that even if the buildings were damaged, the evidence of Blackwell's crimes would survive. As dawn approached on what everyone expected to be a day of violence and revelation, Thomas made his way to his assigned position in the ranch's water tower. The elevated location provided an excellent view of all approaches to the compound, and a system of mirror signals would allow him to communicate with defenders throughout the area. Elizabeth had spent the early morning hours preparing for what might be their family's final day together. She had written letters to relatives back east, hidden what few valuables they possessed, and prepared emergency supplies in case they needed to flee quickly. But most importantly, she had spoken with each of her children, ensuring they understood both the danger they faced and the importance of what they were trying to accomplish. "Remember, she told them as they gathered for what might be their last breakfast together. "We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every honest family that's been hurt by these criminals, and for every family that might be hurt in the future if we don't stop them here." The attack began just after sunrise, with a sound that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder from a storm still beyond the horizon. But as it grew closer, it resolved into the thundering of dozens of horses ridden hard across the prairie, their riders whooping and shouting as they bore down on the ranch compound. Through his telescope, Thomas could see them clearly, a motley collection of hardened men armed with rifles and pistols, their faces masked with bandanas in the style of the notorious Blackwood Gang. They rode with the confidence of men who expected little resistance, believing they were attacking a ranch whose defenses had been compromised by inside information. But as the raiders swept down on the compound, they rode directly into the trap that had been so carefully prepared. The first indication that something was wrong came when several of the lead riders suddenly pitched from their saddles, struck down by rifle fire from concealed positions they hadn't known existed. The carefully coordinated attack dissolved into confusion as horses reared and bucked, throwing their riders or bolting with them, clinging desperately to their saddles. What followed was a battle unlike anything the Wyoming Territory had seen since the Indian Wars. For 3 hours, the sound of gunfire echoed across the prairie as raiders and defenders fought for control of the ranch compound. The attackers had superior numbers, but the defenders had superior positions and the advantage of fighting for their homes and families. Thomas found himself in the middle of the action, not just as an observer, but as an active participant. When a group of raiders attempted to circle around behind the main defensive positions, he abandoned his post in the water tower and joined a squad of defenders in repelling the flanking attack. His old military training, rusty from years of peaceful farming, came flooding back as he found himself firing carefully aimed shots at men who were trying to kill his family. The turning point came when Crawford's deputies executed a brilliant tactical maneuver using their superior mobility to attack the raiders' horses while they were dismounted and seeking cover. Without their mounts, the criminals found themselves trapped in the compound, unable to escape the tightening net of defenders who were systematically eliminating their positions. By late morning, the battle was effectively over. 12 raiders lay dead, while 8 others had been captured alive. Most importantly, several of the prisoners were known associates of Harrison Blackwell, men whose testimony would provide the evidence needed to bring down the entire criminal organization. The victory came at a cost. 3 ranch employees had been killed in the fighting, while 7 others had been wounded, some seriously. The compound itself had suffered significant damage, with several buildings showing the scars of bullet holes and 1 barn partially destroyed by fire. As the smoke cleared and the wounded were being tended to, Thomas finally allowed himself to believe that his family had survived. Elizabeth emerged from their cottage with all 4 children accounted for, though Emma was crying from the noise and confusion, and the twins were pale with shock from witnessing violence beyond their young comprehension. Crawford approached Thomas. As he was reuniting with his family, the marshal's face grim despite their tactical victory. "Mr. Garrett, I need you to know that this isn't over. Blackwell wasn't with the raiders, he's still out there, and he'll know that his operation has been compromised. He's going to be even more dangerous now." The marshal's words proved prophetic. Even as they were securing the prisoners and treating the wounded, reports began arriving of attacks on other ranches across the territory. Blackwell was conducting a systematic campaign of destruction, eliminating evidence and witnesses before Crawford's forces could reach them. "He's trying to create so much chaos that our investigation will be overwhelmed," Crawford explained to Thornfield and Thomas. "If he can destroy enough evidence and eliminate enough witnesses, he might still escape justice." The scope of Blackwell's desperation became clear over the next few days. Banks in 3 territorial capitals reported massive withdrawals from accounts connected to his operations. Railroad officials who had been cooperating with his cattle theft ring were found dead under suspicious circumstances. And most ominously, several prominent territorial officials who might have been called to testify about Blackwell's political connections had suddenly disappeared. Thomas found himself thrust into a role he had never expected, that of a key witness in a federal investigation that would ultimately reshape the territorial justice system. His detailed knowledge of the criminal organization's operations, combined with the evidence he had gathered during his weeks of investigation, made him one of the most important assets in Crawford's case against Blackwell. But with that importance came danger. Blackwell had resources and connections that extended far beyond the Wyoming territory, and he had demonstrated a willingness to use extreme violence to protect his interests. Thomas and his family would need protection not just for days or weeks, but potentially for years as the legal proceedings played out. The events of that November morning had transformed the Garrett family from indentured servants trying to work off a debt into key figures in a criminal investigation that would determine the future of law and order in the American West. They had survived the immediate danger, but their real trials were just beginning. The manhunt for Harrison Blackwell began immediately after the failed raid on the Thornfield Ranch. But tracking a man with unlimited financial resources and political connections across the vast expanse of the American frontier proved to be an extraordinary challenge. Marshal Crawford assembled the largest federal task force ever deployed in the Wyoming territory, with deputies and agents converging from as far away as Denver and Kansas City to join the pursuit. What they discovered as they followed Blackwell's trail was a criminal empire that defied comprehension. Hidden bank accounts in false names contained hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough money to buy entire towns or armies of gunmen. Safe houses and supply depots were scattered across 3 states, each stocked with weapons, provisions, and forged documents that would allow Blackwell to assume new identities and disappear completely. Thomas found himself at the center of this massive investigation, his detailed knowledge of the criminal organization's operations making him invaluable to the federal agents. But his involvement came at a price that grew heavier with each passing day. The Garrett family was now living under constant guard, their movements restricted, and their future uncertain as they waited for the legal proceedings that would determine not just Blackwell's fate, but their own. The first breakthrough in the manhunt came from an unexpected source. Jake Morrison, the night rider whose suspicious behavior had first attracted Thomas's attention, agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for leniency. What Morrison revealed about Blackwell's operations was both shocking and terrifying. He's got safe houses from here to the Mexican border, Morrison told Crawford during a tense interrogation session that Thomas was allowed to observe. Each one stocked with enough supplies to last months and enough gold to buy whatever else he needs. But that's not the worst of it. Morrison's hands shook as he lit a cigarette, the enormity of his betrayal weighing heavily on him. Blackwell's got connections you wouldn't believe. Judges, territorial officials, even some folks in Washington. He's been paying them for years, building up favors and obligations. There's no telling how far his influence reaches. The corruption was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Blackwell had been systematically purchasing influence at every level of government, creating a network of protection that had allowed his criminal organization to operate with virtual impunity. Bank examiners had overlooked suspicious transactions, territorial marshals had misdirected investigations, and court officials had ensured that witnesses disappeared before they could testify. "There's something else," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Blackwell's planning something big. Not just another raid or theft, but something that will let him disappear forever while eliminating everyone who could testify against him." The plan Morrison described was audacious in its scope and horrifying in its implications. Blackwell intended to stage a massacre at the upcoming territorial legislature session in Cheyenne, an event that would bring together most of the officials who could implicate him while providing cover for eliminating specific witnesses. The attack would be blamed on a fictional Indian uprising, and in the chaos that followed, Blackwell would vanish with his accumulated wealth, leaving behind only confusion and death. When? Crawford demanded. Next week. The territorial governor is calling a special session to address the cattle theft problem. Every rancher, every official, every witness in your investigation will be in that building at the same time. The timeline was impossibly tight. The territorial legislature session was scheduled for December 3rd, less than a week away. Hundreds of people would be gathered in Cheyenne's territorial capitol building, making it an ideal target for the kind of mass elimination Blackwell was planning. But canceling the session would alert Blackwell that his plan had been discovered, likely causing him to disappear before he could be captured. Crawford made the difficult decision to allow the legislative session to proceed, using it as bait to draw Blackwell into the open where he could be captured or killed. The territorial capital would be secretly reinforced with federal agents and trusted local law enforcement, creating a trap that would hopefully end Blackwell's reign of terror. Once and for all, Thomas's role in this final confrontation was both crucial and terrifying. As one of the key witnesses, he would be expected to attend the legislative session, placing himself directly in the path of Blackwell's planned attack. But his detailed knowledge of the criminal organization and his ability to identify Blackwell's associates made him invaluable for the federal operation. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Garrett," Crawford said as they finalized the plans. "This is extremely dangerous. Blackwell has nothing left to lose, and he's demonstrated that he's willing to kill anyone who threatens his freedom." Thomas looked at his family, gathered in the main room of their cottage under the watchful eyes of federal guards. Elizabeth held Emma on her lap while the older children played quietly, all of them trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the armed men stationed outside their door. The weight of responsibility was crushing, not just for his own family's safety, but for all the innocent people who would be at risk if Blackwell's plan succeeded. "What choice do I have?" Thomas replied. "If we don't stop him now, he'll keep killing until there's no one left to oppose him." The days leading up to the legislative session were filled with intensive preparation. Federal agents studied detailed plans of the Capitol building, identifying potential ambush points and escape routes. Local law enforcement was quietly briefed on the situation, though only the most trusted officials were told the full scope of the threat. And Thomas spent hours reviewing photographs and descriptions of known Blackwell associates, preparing to identify them if they appeared at the session. Garrett family's situation during this period was particularly difficult. They were essentially prisoners in their own cottage, unable to leave except under heavy guard and cut off from the normal activities that had begun to make the ranch feel like home. The children were becoming restless and frightened, while Elizabeth struggled to maintain hope in the face of an uncertain future. "Are we ever going to be free again?" Mary asked one evening as the family sat together after dinner. At 14, she was old enough to understand the gravity of their situation, but too young to fully comprehend the legal and political complexities that would determine their fate. Thomas didn't have a good answer. Even if Blackwell was captured and his organization dismantled, the Garrett family would likely need protection for months or years while the legal proceedings played out. Their old life as homesteaders was gone forever, and their future remained clouded by forces beyond their control. It was Marcus Thornfield who provided the first glimmer of hope they had felt in weeks. On December 1st, 2 days before the legislative session, he came to their cottage with an unexpected proposal. "Mr. Garrett," he began, taking a seat at their simple wooden table, "I've been thinking about your family situation, and I believe I have a solution that might address both your immediate safety, and your long-term security. Thomas waited, afraid to hope but desperate for any alternative to their current limbo. I'm proposing to make you my full partner in the ranch operation, Thornfield continued. Not as an employee or indentured servant, but as an equal partner, with ownership rights and decision-making authority. The offer was stunning in its generosity. Partnership in the Thornfield Ranch would mean security, prosperity, and social standing beyond anything Thomas had ever imagined. But more importantly, it would provide his family with the protection and resources they would need to rebuild their lives. Why? Thomas asked, still struggling to believe what he was hearing. Because you've proven yourself to be a man of exceptional courage and integrity, Thornfield replied. You've risked everything to help expose this criminal organization, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. That's exactly the kind of character I want in a business partner. But there was more to Thornfield's offer than simple generosity. The cattle theft investigation had revealed serious weaknesses in ranch security and management that needed to be addressed. Thomas's military background, his investigative skills, and his intimate knowledge of criminal operations made him uniquely qualified to help develop new security protocols and management systems. The partnership would be conditional on Blackwell's capture and the successful conclusion of the federal investigation, Thornfield explained. But assuming those conditions are met, your family would have a permanent home here, with full legal protection and financial security. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. After months of uncertainty and fear, the prospect of a stable future seemed almost too good to be true. But Thomas knew that first they had to survive the next few days and the confrontation with Blackwell that would determine everything. The morning of December 3rd dawned clear and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to carry omens of the violence to come. Thomas dressed carefully for the legislative session, wearing his best clothes while concealing a small pistol that Crawford had insisted he carry. The federal agents had done everything possible to prepare for Blackwell's attack, but there were too many variables, too many opportunities for things to go wrong. The Garrett family's goodbye that morning was heartbreaking in its restraint. Everyone knew the dangers Thomas would face, but they also knew that displaying their fears would only make the situation more difficult. Elizabeth kissed him with a fierce intensity that spoke of her terror and love, while the children hugged him with the desperate clinginess of young people who weren't certain they would see their father again. "Come back to us," Elizabeth whispered as Thomas prepared to leave with his federal escort. "I will," he promised, though both of them knew it was a vow that might be beyond his power to keep. The Territorial Capitol building in Cheyenne was an imposing structure of red brick and limestone, designed to project the stability and permanence that territorial officials hoped would characterize Wyoming's future. On this particular morning, it was also crawling with hidden federal agents, their presence carefully concealed but their vigilance unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Thomas took his assigned seat in the visitors' gallery, ostensibly there to observe the proceedings but actually serving as both bait and lookout for Crawford's operation. Around him, ranchers and businessmen filled the available seats, all of them unaware that they were sitting in what might become a battlefield within the next few hours. The legislative session began with routine territorial business discussions of taxation, infrastructure development, and agricultural policy that would normally have put Thomas to sleep. But today he found himself studying every face in the crowd, looking for the telltale signs that would indicate Blackwell's presence, or that of his associates. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the main chamber, but from the hallways outside. A federal agent posing as a legislative clerk approached Crawford with urgent news that he whispered quickly into the marshal's ear. Thomas saw Crawford's expression change, his face paling as he absorbed whatever information he had received. Blackwell's attack wasn't going to come during the legislative session itself. Instead, he had planned something far more diabolical, a bombing that would destroy the entire building and everyone in it, eliminating all witnesses and evidence in one catastrophic explosion. The federal agents had discovered the plot just minutes before it was scheduled to be executed, but there might not be enough time to evacuate the building safely. What followed was a carefully controlled panic as federal agents began moving through the crowd, quietly informing key officials of the danger while trying to avoid the mass hysteria that would make evacuation impossible. Thomas found himself pressed into service, his familiarity with the building's layout making him valuable for organizing the evacuation routes. But even as people began filing out of the building in what appeared to be an orderly recess, Thomas spotted a face that made his blood run cold. Harrison Blackwell himself was in the crowd, dressed as a respectable businessman and carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel that could easily contain the triggering device for his planned explosion. Thomas caught Crawford's eye and pointed toward Blackwell, setting in motion the final confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of law and order in the Wyoming Territory. The chase that followed would lead through the streets of Cheyenne, across the frozen prairie, and ultimately to a showdown that would become legend in the annals of frontier justice. As federal agents moved to apprehend Blackwell, the criminal mastermind realized that his carefully laid plans had been discovered. With the ruthless pragmatism that had characterized his entire criminal career, he abandoned his bombing plot and fled the building, determined to escape and fight another day. The manhunt that followed would test every skill Thomas had learned during his weeks of investigation, every lesson Crawford had taught him about tracking dangerous men, and every ounce of courage he possessed as he found himself pursuing one of the most dangerous criminals in the American West through the unforgiving landscape of the Wyoming frontier. Harrison Blackwell moved through the evacuating crowd with the calculated precision of a man who had spent years planning for exactly this moment. Despite the federal agents closing in around him, he maintained the unhurried pace of a respectable businessman leaving a boring government meeting, his expensive overcoat and polished boots helping him blend seamlessly with the other well-dressed attendees filing out of the territorial capital. Thomas shadowed him from a distance of about 20 feet, communicating Blackwell's position to Crawford through a series of subtle hand signals they had practiced during the preparation phase. The challenge was maintaining visual contact without alerting Blackwell to the surveillance, a delicate balance that required Thomas to use every skill he had developed during his weeks of covert investigation. The evacuation proceeded with deceptive calm, but Thomas could see the tension in the federal agents' movements as they tried to position themselves for Blackwell's capture without causing a panic that might endanger hundreds of innocent civilians. The narrow hallways and staircases of the Capitol building created natural choke points that could work either for or against them, depending on how Blackwell chose to react when he realized his escape routes were being systematically cut off. First sign that Blackwell suspected the trap came when he paused at the main staircase, leading to the building's primary exit. For just a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped, and Thomas saw him scanning the crowd with the sharp, calculating gaze of a predator who sensed danger. When Blackwell's eyes briefly met his own, Thomas felt a chill of recognition pass between them. The criminal mastermind knew he was being watched. What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. Instead of continuing toward the main exit where Crawford's agents were waiting, Blackwell suddenly veered toward a side corridor that led to the building's service areas. The leather satchel he carried swung heavily at his side, and Thomas caught a glimpse of wires protruding from its edges. The bombing device was still active, still capable of devastating destruction if Blackwell chose to use it. "He's moving toward the basement," Thomas called out, abandoning all pretense of stealth as Blackwell broke into a run. The chase that followed led through a maze of service corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces that most visitors to the Capitol building never saw. Blackwell moved with surprising agility for a man of his age and social position, clearly familiar with the building's layout and prepared for the possibility of pursuit. Behind him, Thomas and 3 federal agents fought to keep pace while avoiding the obstacles and dead ends that their quarry seemed to navigate effortlessly. The basement level of the Capitol building was a labyrinth of steam pipes, coal storage areas, and maintenance equipment that provided perfect cover for an armed fugitive. Worse, the confined spaces and poor lighting made it almost impossible to apprehend Blackwell without risking civilian casualties from stray gunfire. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the corridors, creating a cacophony that made it difficult to determine exact positions. "Garrett!" Blackwell's voice suddenly called out from somewhere ahead, the cultured tones carrying an edge of desperate fury. "I know you're back there, you miserable farmer. Do you have any idea what you've cost me?" Thomas motioned for the federal agents to hold their positions while he tried to pinpoint Blackwell's location. The criminal was clearly trying to draw them into an ambush, using his voice to mask his movements while preparing to strike. But there was something else in Blackwell's tone, a barely controlled rage that suggested he was no longer thinking clearly, making him both more dangerous and more likely to make mistakes. "You were nothing," Blackwell continued, his voice coming from a different direction now. "A failed homesteader with debts you couldn't pay, and you've destroyed an empire that took me 20 years to build." The federal agents were closing in from multiple directions, using hand signals to coordinate their movements, while Thomas continued to track Blackwell's position. But the maze-like basement offered dozens of potential escape routes, including access to the building's steam tunnels that connected to other structures throughout downtown Cheyenne. The confrontation came at the basement's main boiler room, a vast space filled with massive coal-fired furnaces that provided heat for the entire building. Blackwell had taken position behind one of the boilers, using the heavy iron construction as cover while he prepared to make his final stand. The leather satchel sat ominously at his feet, its wire connections clearly visible and apparently ready for activation. "That's far enough," Blackwell called out as the federal agents took positions around the room's entrances. "I've got enough explosives here to bring down half this building, and I'm not going to prison." Crawford stepped forward, his hands visible and his voice calm despite the desperate situation. "Mr. Blackwell, you're surrounded and outgunned. There's no escape from this building, and triggering that device will only ensure that you die along with everyone else." "Maybe that's exactly what I want," Blackwell replied, his voice carrying the hollow ring of a man who had reached the end of his rope. "I'd rather go out in a blaze of glory than spend the rest of my life in a federal prison." But Thomas could see something that the others might have missed. Blackwell's hands were shaking, and he kept glancing toward a service door on the far side of the boiler room. The man was terrified, despite his defiant words, and he was still looking for a way out. The bravado was a mask for desperation, and desperation could be exploited. "You don't want to die here, Blackwell," Thomas said, stepping into view despite Crawford's urgent gestures for him to remain hidden. "You're too smart for that, too used to winning. You've got contingency plans, escape routes, money hidden away. Why throw it all away for revenge?" Blackwell's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Contingency plans? You've destroyed everything, farmer. My banks are closed, my associates are dead or captured, my political connections are worthless. There's nothing left." "There's always something left," Thomas replied, moving slowly closer while keeping his hands visible. "Money can be replaced, organizations can be rebuilt, but only if you're alive to do it." The psychological battle was as intense as any physical confrontation. Thomas was gambling that Blackwell's survival instincts would overcome his rage, that the criminal's pragmatic nature would assert itself even in these desperate circumstances. But he was also aware that one wrong word, one miscalculation, could trigger an explosion that would kill them all. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Blackwell snarled. playing on my instincts, trying to talk me into surrender. But I know what happens to men like me in federal custody. I've seen what Crawford does to prisoners who don't cooperate. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Crawford's reputation for extracting information from reluctant witnesses was well known throughout the territory, though Thomas had seen no evidence of the brutality that Blackwell was implying. Still, the criminal's fear was real, and fear could make even intelligent men do irrational things. It was at that moment that Thomas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of continuing the psychological pressure, he chose direct action, lunging toward the explosive device while Blackwell was distracted by his conversation with Crawford. The move was desperate and dangerous, but it was also the only chance they had of preventing a catastrophic explosion. The struggle that followed was brief but vicious. Blackwell was older and softer than Thomas, but he fought with the desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. They crashed into the boiler room's control equipment, sending gauges and valves spinning as they grappled for control of the explosive device. Thomas managed to grab the satchel's wire connections, trying to disable the triggering mechanism while Blackwell clawed at his face and throat. The criminal produced a small pistol from his coat, pressing it against Thomas's ribs while screaming incoherently about revenge and justice and the unfairness of his downfall. The shot, when it came, echoed through the boiler room like thunder. But it wasn't Blackwell who fired. One of Crawford's agents had found a clear line of sight and taken the shot that ended the criminal mastermind's reign of terror. Blackwell collapsed against the massive boiler, his expensive clothes stained with blood, his carefully maintained facade finally stripped away to reveal the desperate, frightened man beneath. Thomas sat on the floor beside the disabled explosive device, his hands shaking as the adrenaline of combat began to fade. Around him, federal agents were securing the scene and checking for additional threats, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional chaos he was experiencing. "Is it over?" he asked Crawford as the marshal helped him to his feet. "This part is," Crawford replied grimly. "But there's still a lot of work to be done." Blackwell's organization was vast, and there are still associates out there who might try to continue his operations or seek revenge for his death. Cleanup operation that followed Blackwell's death was as complex and challenging as the investigation that had preceded it. Federal agents spent weeks tracking down the criminal organization's remaining assets, arresting minor accomplices, and dismantling the network of corruption that had protected Blackwell's operations for so many years. Thomas found himself at the center of this effort, his detailed knowledge of the criminal organization making him invaluable for identifying key players and understanding operational patterns. But the work was exhausting and emotionally draining, requiring him to relive repeatedly the months of investigation and the violent confrontation that had ended Blackwell's life. The legal proceedings were equally challenging. Grand juries in 3 territorial capitals heard testimony about the scope of Blackwell's criminal empire, while federal prosecutors worked to untangle the complex web of financial crimes that had funded his operations. Thomas testified for days at a time, describing everything from the cattle theft patterns he had discovered to the final confrontation in the Capitol building's basement. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the aftermath was the personal toll it took on the Garrett family. The months of investigation, the constant threat of violence, and the uncertainty about their future had strained everyone to the breaking point. Elizabeth struggled with nightmares and anxiety, while the children displayed various symptoms of trauma ranging from Samuel's premature seriousness to Emma's clingy behavior and frequent crying. It was during this difficult period that Marcus Thornfield's partnership offer proved to be more than just a generous gesture. It became a lifeline that allowed the family to begin rebuilding their lives. The legal framework of the partnership was complex, requiring federal approval and extensive documentation to ensure that it didn't compromise Thomas's role as a witness. But once the arrangements were finalized, the Garrett family found themselves with security and opportunities they had never imagined possible. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Thomas had to learn new skills related to large-scale ranch management, financial planning, and personnel administration. The transition from indentured servant to business partner required adjustments in his relationships with other ranch employees, some of whom resented his rapid advancement while others welcomed his leadership and fresh perspectives. Elizabeth found her own role evolving as well. As a partner's wife, she was expected to participate in the social activities of the territorial elite, attending dinner parties and charitable events that required new clothes, new manners, and new levels of confidence. But she also discovered unexpected talents for organization and administration, eventually taking responsibility for managing the ranch's domestic operations and employee welfare programs. The children adapted with the resilience that young people often display in changing circumstances. Samuel grew into his role as the son of a prominent rancher, developing skills in horsemanship, cattle management, and business that would serve him well in his adult life. Mary blossomed into a young lady of considerable grace and intelligence, while the twins channeled their energy into academic pursuits under the guidance of the ranch's expanded educational program. Even little Emma seemed to thrive in the ranch environment, growing from a frightened toddler into a confident and adventurous child who charmed everyone from the hardest cowboys to the most distinguished visitors. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities. As Thornfield's partner, Thomas found himself involved in territorial politics and business affairs that extended far beyond the ranch's boundaries. He was called upon to testify before territorial committees, to participate in discussions about statehood, and to help shape policies that would affect the entire region's development. The cattle theft problem, while not entirely eliminated, was significantly reduced by the destruction of Blackwool's organization and the implementation of new security measures that Thomas helped design. These innovations, ranging from improved communication systems to coordinated patrol strategies, were adopted by ranchers throughout the territory and became models for similar operations across the American West. Perhaps most importantly, the events had established Thomas as a figure of considerable influence and respect within the territorial community. Men who had once looked down on him as a failed homesteader now sought his advice on matters ranging from business strategy to criminal investigation. His reputation for courage and integrity opened doors that had previously been closed to someone of his background. As winter gave way to spring and then to summer, the Garrett family began to feel truly at home on the Thornfield Ranch. The cottage that had once seemed like a temporary shelter became a comfortable family residence, expanded, and improved to accommodate their changing status. The work that had once felt like servitude became a calling that combined Thomas's natural abilities with opportunities for growth and advancement. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated their lives for so many months gradually gave way to confidence and optimism about the future. They had survived an ordeal that had tested them in ways they never could have imagined, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united as a family. The events that had begun with a debt auction in Cheyenne had transformed not just the Garrett family's circumstances, but their understanding of what was possible in the American West. They had learned that courage and integrity could overcome even the most desperate circumstances, that justice was possible even in a lawless land, and that the bonds of family and community could provide strength in the face of any challenge. 3 years after the events that had nearly destroyed the Wyoming Territory's ranching industry, Thomas Garrett stood on the wide front porch of his newly constructed family home, watching the sun set over land that now belonged to him and his children. The house was a far cry from the simple cottage where his family had first lived as indentured servants to stories of native stone and imported timber. with modern conveniences that included indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and a telephone connection. To the outside world, the transformation of his family's circumstances still seemed surreal at times. Where once they had owned nothing but the clothes on their backs and a crushing burden of debt, they now possessed thousands of acres of prime, grazing land, herds of prize-winning cattle, and financial investments that stretched from Denver to Chicago. But more important than the material wealth was the respect and influence that Thomas had earned through his courage during the Trojan Blackwell crisis and his subsequent contributions to territorial development. The partnership with Marcus Thornfield had evolved into something far more significant than either man had originally envisioned. What had begun as a generous gesture to help a family in desperate circumstances had become a dynamic business relationship that had revolutionized ranching practices throughout the region. Thomas's background as a homesteader, combined with his investigative skills and natural leadership abilities, had brought fresh perspectives to problems that had plagued large-scale operations for decades. One of their most successful innovations had been the development of a cooperative security system that allowed multiple ranches to share intelligence and coordinate defensive measures against cattle thieves and other criminal threats. The network, which Thomas had designed based on his experiences investigating Blackwell's organization, had reduced livestock losses by more than 70% across participating ranches and had become a model for similar programs in other territories. But the success had come at a personal cost that was only now becoming fully apparent. The years of constant vigilance, the ongoing legal proceedings related to Blackwell's criminal empire, and the pressures of managing a rapidly growing business empire had taken their toll on Thomas's health and emotional well-being. He suffered from recurring nightmares about the confrontation in the Capitol building's basement, and the weight of responsibility for his family's security sometimes felt overwhelming. Elizabeth had noticed the changes in her husband, the way he would sometimes stare off into the distance with a haunted expression, or how he would check and recheck the locks on their doors before retiring each evening. The trauma of their ordeal hadn't simply disappeared with their improved circumstances. It had been buried beneath layers of success and responsibility, waiting for quiet moments to resurface and remind them of how fragile their security really was. The children, now growing into young adults, were dealing with their own challenges related to their family's dramatic change in social status. Samuel, at 19, had become an accomplished horseman and cattle handler, but he struggled with the expectations that came with being the son of one of the territory's most prominent ranchers. Some of his peers resented his family's rapid rise, while others tried to befriend him solely because of his father's influence and wealth. Mary, now 17 and considered one of the territory's most eligible young women, found herself caught between the refined world of territorial high society and her memories of the desperate poverty her family had once endured. She had received proposals from the sons of prominent families across 3 states, but none of the young men seemed to understand or appreciate the experiences that had shaped her character. The twins, Jacob and Joshua, had channeled their energy into academic pursuits with an intensity that sometimes worried their parents. Both boys had demonstrated exceptional mathematical abilities and showed interest in engineering and scientific subjects that were far advanced for their rural environment. Thomas and Elizabeth had begun discussing the possibility of sending them to Eastern universities, an opportunity that their improved circumstances now made possible, but which would mean separation from the family for years at a time. Even little Emma, now 4 years old and the undisputed princess of the ranch, was growing up with privileges and expectations that were vastly different from those her siblings had experienced. She rode her own pony with fearless confidence, spoke French with a governess imported from New Orleans, and displayed a precocious intelligence that both delighted and occasionally concerned her parents. The success of the Thornfield Garrett partnership had attracted attention from investors and business leaders across the nation. Railroad magnates sought their advice on route planning and station locations. Eastern cattle buyers competed for exclusive contracts with their operations, and politicians from Washington had begun courting Thomas's support for territorial statehood. Initiatives. One particularly significant development had been their expansion into banking and finance. Using capital generated from their ranching operations, they had established the Territorial Development Bank, which specialized in providing credit to homesteaders and small ranchers who had previously been excluded from traditional financial services. The bank's lending practices, which emphasized character and local knowledge over rigid collateral requirements, had helped hundreds of families avoid the kind of debt crisis that had once threatened the Garretts. The bank had also become a tool for economic justice, providing fair credit terms to immigrant families and minorities who had been systematically excluded from mainstream financial institutions. Thomas had insisted on these policies, drawing on his own experiences with debt and poverty to ensure that the bank served the needs of working families rather than simply maximizing profits for wealthy investors. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the gradual healing of the psychological wounds that the Blackwell crisis had inflicted on the entire family. Time, prosperity, and the security of their new circumstances had allowed them to process their trauma and begin building positive memories to replace the dark ones that had dominated their thoughts for so long. The healing process had been helped considerably by their involvement in community activities and charitable work. Elizabeth had established a foundation that provided assistance to widows and orphans throughout the territory, while Thomas had become a leading advocate for improved education and infrastructure development. Their efforts had not only helped others, but had given them a sense of purpose that extended beyond their personal success. The territorial political situation had also evolved significantly since Blackwell's death. The corruption that had plagued government institutions had been largely eliminated through federal oversight and reform initiatives that Thomas had helped design. New laws had been enacted to prevent the kind of criminal infiltration that had made Blackwell's empire possible, while improved law enforcement coordination had made the territory a safer place for honest families to build their lives. Wyoming's path toward statehood had accelerated as well, with Thomas serving on several committees tasked with drafting the new state's constitution and legal framework. His experiences with both the criminal justice system and business regulation had made him a valuable contributor to discussions about how to balance economic development with social responsibility and individual rights. The statehood process had also provided an opportunity for the Garrett family to fully integrate into the territory's social and political elite. Thomas had been approached about running for various offices, including territorial representative and eventually governor of the new state. While he hadn't made any firm commitments, the possibility represented a level of influence and responsibility that would have been unimaginable during their days as struggling homesteaders. On this particular evening, as Thomas stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, he was joined by Marcus Thornfield, who had ridden over from the main ranch house to discuss plans for their upcoming cattle drive to the railroad terminus in Cheyenne. The two men had developed a friendship that transcended their business partnership, built on mutual respect and shared experiences that had tested both their courage and their character. "Hard to believe it's been 3 years," Thornfield said, settling into one of the comfortable chairs that Elizabeth had arranged on the porch. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what his partner meant. The memories of that desperate autumn when his family had faced debt auction were still vivid, but they seemed to belong to different people, a younger, more desperate version of himself, and a family that had been shaped by poverty and powerlessness rather than prosperity and influence. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bid on us that day?" Thomas asked. Thornfield was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. I used to think it was just good fortune, being in the right place at the right time, to help a family in need. But now I think it was something more than that. I think we were meant to work together, to build something bigger than either of us could have accomplished alone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Samuel, who had ridden in from the northern pastures with news about the cattle. Drive preparations. At 19, he had grown into a tall, confident young man who combined his father's practical intelligence with his mother's gentle wisdom. His report on the cattle conditions and route planning demonstrated a maturity and competence that filled Thomas with pride. "The herds are in excellent condition," Samuel reported, dismounting from his horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent half his life in the saddle. "We should be able to move 2,000 head without any significant losses, assuming the weather holds." The cattle drive represented more than just a business transaction. It was a symbol of how far the family had come and how completely they had integrated into the ranching community. 3 years earlier, Thomas had been a failed homesteader facing indentured servitude. Now he was planning one of the largest cattle drives in territorial history, with buyers from Chicago and New York competing for his livestock. As the evening progressed and the family gathered for dinner in their spacious dining room, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The long table was set with fine china and silver, lit by gas lamps that cast a warm glow over faces that showed the effects of prosperity and security. Elizabeth, elegant in a dress that had been tailored in Denver, presided over the meal with a grace that would have been impossible during their desperate early days. The conversation during dinner ranged from Samuel's plans for expanding their breeding program to Mary's upcoming debut at the territorial governor's mansion, from the twins' latest academic achievements to Emma's adventures with her pony. It was the kind of family discussion that Thomas had dreamed of during those dark months when survival had been their only concern. But even amid the comfort and security of their new life, Thomas couldn't entirely escape the shadows of their past experiences. The lessons learned during the Blackwell crisis about the fragility of security, the importance of vigilance, and the responsibility that came with power continued to influence his decisions and shape his family's values. After dinner, as the family gathered in the parlor for their evening activities, Thomas found himself thinking about the broader implications of their story. They had been saved by the generosity of a stranger, but they had earned their current position through hard work, courage, and integrity. Their success was not just a personal triumph, but a testament to the possibilities that existed in the American West, for those willing to face its challenges with determination and moral courage. The evening concluded with a family tradition that had developed over the past year, a time of sharing gratitude for their blessings and discussing their hopes for the future. Each family member contributed something, from Emma's innocent delight in her pony to Samuel's ambitious plans for improving cattle breeding techniques. When it came time for Thomas to speak, he found himself struggling to put into words the profound gratitude he felt for the journey that had brought them to this point. 3 years ago, he began, we had nothing but each other and our determination to stay together as a family. Tonight, we have more than I ever dreamed possible, not just material wealth, but the respect of our community, the security of our future, and the knowledge that we've helped make life better for others who faced the same challenges we once did. He paused, looking at each family member in turn, seeing in their faces the reflections of their shared experiences and their individual growth. But the most important thing we have is still each other. Everything else, the ranch, the business, the social position, all of that is temporary. What matters is that we've stayed true to our values and to each other, no matter how much our circumstances have changed. Elizabeth reached across to take his hand, her touch conveying the deep understanding that had sustained their marriage through poverty and prosperity alike. And we've learned that sometimes what seems like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something better than we could have imagined. As the family prepared for bed that evening, Thomas made his customary rounds of the house, checking locks and ensuring that everything was secure. But tonight, the ritual felt different, less like the anxious vigilance of a man haunted by past dangers and more like the reasonable caution of someone who understood the value of what he was protecting. Standing at the window of his bedroom, looking out over the moonlit landscape that stretched to the horizon, Thomas could see the lights of other ranch houses scattered across the valley, families like his own who had found prosperity and security in this harsh but promising land. The sight filled him with a sense of connection to something larger than his own family's story, a recognition that their journey from debt and desperation to wealth and influence was part of the larger American story of transformation and opportunity. The final image of that evening would stay with Thomas for the rest of his life. Elizabeth sitting at her dressing table, brushing her hair in the lamplight while humming a gentle melody that Emma had been practicing on the piano. It was a scene of such perfect domestic tranquility that it seemed to erase all the darkness and fear that had once dominated their lives. In that moment, Thomas understood that their story was complete, not because it had ended, but because it had found its proper resolution. They had faced the worst that life could offer and had emerged not just victorious, but transformed into better versions of themselves. The debt that had once threatened to destroy them had become the catalyst for a life beyond their wildest dreams, and the stranger who had bought their labor had become not just a business partner, but a true friend who had helped them discover their own potential. The American West had tested the Garrett family with poverty, danger, and seemingly impossible challenges. But it had also rewarded their courage, integrity, and determination with opportunities that would have been unimaginable in the more settled regions of the country. Their story was proof that in this vast, untamed land, a man's worth was determined not by his past failures but by his willingness to face the future with hope and determination. As Thomas finally settled into bed beside his wife, surrounded by the security and comfort they had built together, he realized that their greatest victory had not been the accumulation of wealth or social status, but the preservation of their family's unity and values through circumstances that could have easily destroyed both. They had learned that true prosperity was not just about material success, but about the strength to help others, the wisdom to use power responsibly, and the grace to remember their own humble beginnings even as they reached heights they had never dreamed possible. The transformation was complete, but the story would continue in the lives of their children and grandchildren, who would carry forward the lessons learned during those desperate months, when everything seemed lost but hope itself proved to be the foundation upon which a new and better life could be built. The telegram arrived on a crisp October morning in 1892, 5 years after the events that had transformed the Garrett family from desperate debtors into one of Wyoming's most influential ranching dynasties. Thomas was reviewing the morning reports from his various business enterprises when his secretary, Mrs. Adelaide Richardson, entered his private office with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her normally composed voice trembling slightly, "this telegram just arrived from Washington. I believe you'll want to read it immediately." The message was brief but momentous. President Benjamin Harrison was formally inviting Thomas to serve as the first Secretary of Agriculture for the newly admitted state of Wyoming, a position that would place him at the forefront of Western agricultural policy and development. The appointment would require the family to relocate to the territorial capital and eventually to Washington, D.C., for portions of each year, representing a level of national prominence that exceeded even Thomas's most ambitious dreams. The invitation was not entirely unexpected. Thomas's innovations in ranching, his role in establishing cooperative security networks, and his leadership in the banking industry had attracted attention from agricultural interests across the nation. His testimony before congressional committees about Western development had impressed lawmakers with his practical knowledge and clear vision for the region's future. Moreover, his reputation for integrity and his dramatic personal story had made him a symbol of the American Dream in action. But accepting the position would mean leaving behind the ranch. That had become not just their home but their identity. The Thornfield-Garrett partnership had evolved into one of the most successful agricultural enterprises in the American West, with operations spanning 3 states and employing over 800 people. Walking away from this empire to enter government service would require sacrifices that affected not just Thomas and Elizabeth, but their entire extended family of employees and business associates. The decision sparked intense discussions within the Garrett household. Samuel, now 22 and fully capable of managing the ranch operations, argued passionately that his father should accept the appointment. "Pa, this is bigger than just our family or even our ranch," he said during a family meeting that evening. "You could shape agricultural policy for the entire nation, help thousands of families avoid the kind of poverty we once faced." Mary, now 20 and engaged to the son of a prominent Denver businessman, expressed concerns about the social implications of such a dramatic change. "We've built a life here, established relationships and responsibilities. How can we simply abandon all of that for the uncertainty of political life?" The twins, Jacob and Joshua, now 15 and preparing for admission to Yale University, were fascinated by the intellectual challenges that government service would present. Their academic interests had expanded beyond mathematics and engineering to include economics, political science, and social reform, making their father's potential appointment particularly exciting to them. Elizabeth's perspective was characteristically practical and insightful. During a private conversation with Thomas later that evening, she reminded him of the broader purpose that had guided their family through its most difficult times. "We've been blessed with more than we ever imagined possible," she said. "Maybe this is our opportunity to use those blessings to help others on a much larger scale." The decision was complicated by Marcus Thornfield's unexpected announcement that he was considering retirement from active ranch management. At 60, he had begun to feel the physical toll of decades spent building and managing his empire. His children had shown little interest in continuing the family business, preferring instead to pursue careers in law and medicine in eastern cities. The ranch needed new leadership, and Thomas's departure would create a vacuum that might be impossible to fill. "I won't pretend that losing you wouldn't be a significant blow to our operations," Thornfield admitted during their discussion of the Washington appointment. "But I also recognize that your talents and experience could benefit far more people in government service than they can here on the ranch." The conversation revealed Thornfield's own evolution over the years since the Blackwell crisis. The hard-driving businessman who had built a cattle empire through sheer determination had gradually developed a broader perspective on social responsibility and public service. His partnership with Thomas had taught him that true success was measured not just in profits but in positive impact on the community and the lives of ordinary people. After a week of family discussions and consultations with trusted advisors, Thomas made the decision that would define the next chapter of his remarkable life. He would accept the appointment as Wyoming's first Secretary of Agriculture, but with conditions that would allow him to maintain his ranch interests and continue his business partnership with Thornfield. The arrangement required complex negotiations with government officials and business associates. Thomas would serve in Washington for 6 months of each year, returning to Wyoming for the remaining 6 months to oversee ranch operations and maintain his connections to the agricultural community. He would be representing. Samuel would assume day-to-day management responsibilities, with Marcus Thornfield serving as senior advisor and Elizabeth coordinating the family's divided residences. The announcement of Thomas's appointment created a sensation throughout the Wyoming Territory and beyond. Newspapers from Denver to New York ran feature stories about the former homesteader who had risen to national prominence through courage, integrity, and business acumen. The narrative of his journey from debt auction to cabinet-level appointment captured the public imagination and reinforced the mythology of the American West as a land of infinite possibility, but the appointment also brought new challenges and responsibilities that tested the family in unexpected ways. The political environment in Washington was far more complex and treacherous than anything Thomas had encountered in his business career. Established agricultural interests viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as an outsider who lacked the proper credentials and connections for such an important position. Eastern politicians questioned whether a Western rancher could understand the needs of farmers in more settled regions of the country. The Garrett family's first months in Washington were a series of social and political adjustments that required all of their accumulated wisdom and resilience. They rented a fashionable townhouse in Georgetown, hired a staff of domestic servants, and began the process of integrating into the capital's elite social circles. Elizabeth, drawing on skills she had developed during her years as a rancher's wife, navigated the complex protocols of Washington society with surprising grace and effectiveness. Thomas's early months as Secretary of Agriculture were marked by both significant achievements and frustrating setbacks. His proposals for federal support of agricultural education and research were well received by congressional committees, but his advocacy for small farmer assistance programs encountered resistance from established interests that preferred minimal government intervention in agricultural markets. One of his most significant early initiatives was the establishment of a federal program to provide low-interest loans to homesteaders and small farmers, modeled on the successful practices he had developed through his Territorial Development Bank. The program faced fierce opposition from traditional banking interests, but Thomas's reputation for integrity and his dramatic, personal story helped build public support for the initiative. The political battles in Washington were unlike anything Thomas had experienced during his career, where business negotiations were typically direct and results-oriented. Political maneuvering involved layers of complexity, hidden agendas, and shifting alliances that required entirely different skills and strategies. Thomas found himself learning to navigate a world where personal relationships, party loyalty, and regional interests often mattered more than policy merits or logical arguments. His most powerful asset in this environment proved to be his authenticity and his willingness to speak truth regardless of political consequences. During congressional hearings, Thomas would often begin his testimony by reminding listeners of his own experiences with agricultural poverty and debt, lending personal weight to his policy recommendations. His ability to connect abstract policy discussions to real human experiences made him an effective advocate for rural interests. The family's divided life between Washington and Wyoming created its own set of challenges. The children struggled with constantly changing social environments and educational systems, while Elizabeth found herself managing two separate households with completely different social expectations and daily routines. The financial costs of maintaining residences in both locations were substantial, even for a family with their level of wealth. Samuel's management of the ranch operations during his father's absence proved to be both a challenge and an opportunity for the young man to demonstrate his capabilities. Under his leadership, the ranch continued to prosper and expand, but he faced skepticism from some longtime employees who questioned whether someone so young could effectively replace the legendary partnership of Thornfield and Garrett. The test of Samuel's leadership came during a severe winter that threatened to devastate livestock across the entire region. When traditional feed supplies were exhausted and transportation networks were disrupted by blizzards, Samuel organized an unprecedented cooperative effort among neighboring ranches to share resources and coordinate rescue operations. His success in minimizing losses during this crisis established his credibility as a capable manager and earned him the respect of even the most skeptical employees. Meanwhile, in Washington, Thomas was fighting political battles that would have long-term implications for American agricultural policy. His advocacy for federal investment in agricultural research led to the establishment of experimental stations in western states, while his support for rural education programs helped create the foundation for what would eventually become the agricultural extension system. Perhaps his most controversial initiative was his proposal for federal regulation of agricultural commodity markets to prevent the kind of price manipulation that had contributed to the economic distress experienced by farmers like himself during the 1880s. The proposal encountered fierce resistance from commodity traders and railroad interests, but it laid the groundwork for future regulatory reforms that would provide greater stability for agricultural producers. That the political pressures of Washington began to take their toll on Thomas's health and family relationships. The constant travel between Wyoming and Washington, the stress of navigating complex political negotiations, and the burden of representing not just his own state, but the entire agricultural community of the American West, created a level of pressure that was physically and emotionally exhausting. Elizabeth noticed the changes in her husband, the way he would spend hours poring over policy documents late into the night, the tension that seemed to permanently settle in his shoulders, and the distant expression that would sometimes cross his face during family conversations. The man who had once found such joy in the simple pleasures of ranch life now seemed burdened by responsibilities that extended far beyond anything he had previously imagined. The family's Washington social life, while successful by conventional measures, lacked the warmth and authenticity of their Wyoming community. Dinner parties and receptions were opportunities for political networking rather than genuine friendship, and the children struggled to form meaningful relationships with peers whose experiences and values were so different from their own. It was during this period of adjustment and challenge that an unexpected crisis would test both Thomas's political skills and his family's resilience in ways that would ultimately define his legacy as both a public servant and a father. The crisis began with a telegram from Samuel reporting unusual activities on the northern boundaries of their ranch that suggested the possible return of organized cattle theft operations. The message was brief but alarming. "Pa, need you home immediately. Strange riders, missing cattle, employees reporting threats. Situation reminds me of the Blackwell days. Fear we may be facing a new criminal organization. Samuel." The telegram arrived just as Thomas was preparing for crucial congressional hearings on his agricultural research funding proposal, an initiative that represented months of careful political preparation and negotiation. Leaving Washington at such a critical moment would effectively kill the proposal and potentially damage his credibility with congressional allies who had invested their own political capital in supporting his initiatives. But the safety of his family and the ranch community that depended on his leadership took precedence over political considerations. Within hours of receiving Samuel's message, Thomas was on a train heading west, carrying with him not just personal concerns, but also federal resources and authority that might be necessary to address whatever threat was emerging on the Wyoming frontier. The journey back to Wyoming gave Thomas time to reflect on the complex web of responsibilities and relationships that now defined his life. He was no longer simply a rancher protecting his own interests, but a federal official whose actions would be scrutinized by political opponents and supporters alike. His response to the crisis would need to balance family loyalty with public duty, Western frontier justice with federal law enforcement protocols. As the train carried him across the Great Plains toward the mountains of Wyoming, Thomas found himself thinking about the circular nature of his journey. 5 years earlier, he had helped expose and destroy a criminal organization that had threatened the economic foundation of the territory. Now it appeared that new threats were emerging, possibly organized by survivors or imitators of the Blackwell organization who had learned from the previous failures. The landscape rushing past his train window was familiar and comforting after months in the confines of Washington's urban environment. The vast open spaces, the scattered ranches and small towns, The sense of endless possibility that had first attracted him to the West. All of these elements reminded him of why he had been willing to sacrifice everything to build a life in this harsh but magnificent land. But he was returning as a different man than the one who had left for Washington 6 months earlier. The political battles, the constant pressure of public scrutiny, and the weight of representing agricultural interests across the entire nation had changed him in ways that were both subtle and profound. He would need to rediscover how to be both a federal official and a Western rancher, how to balance national responsibilities with local loyalties. Thomas arrived at the ranch just before dawn, the familiar silhouette of the main buildings emerging from the morning mist like old friends, welcoming him home. But something was different in the atmosphere, an undercurrent of tension that reminded him uncomfortably of those dangerous days during the Blackwell investigation. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter with unusual vigilance, and the ranch hands moved with the careful awareness of men who expected trouble. Samuel met his father at the main house, his young face showing the strain of leadership under pressure. In the 5 days since sending the telegram, the situation had escalated rapidly. 3 more ranches in the region had reported missing cattle, and 2 ranch hands had been found dead under circumstances that suggested execution rather than accidental death. "It's not random theft, Pa," Samuel explained as they walked toward Thomas's study. "These people know our operations, our schedules, our security arrangements. Someone's been watching us for months, maybe years." The evidence Samuel presented was both comprehensive and chilling. Maps marked with ranch layouts, detailed schedules of cattle movements, and even sketches of individual employees suggested surveillance far more sophisticated than typical rustling operations. Most disturbing was a list of names that included several prominent ranchers, territorial officials, and federal law enforcement officers, indicating that whoever was behind the new threat had access to high-level intelligence. "There's something else," Samuel continued, producing a leather portfolio that had been left deliberately where ranch security would find it. "This was meant for us to discover. I think they're trying to send a message." Inside the portfolio was a photograph that made Thomas's blood run cold. It showed Elizabeth and Emma walking through Georgetown near their Washington residence, clearly taken without their knowledge. Written on the back in precise handwriting were the words, "Federal. Appointments don't protect families from frontier justice." The threat was unmistakably clear. Thomas's position as Secretary of Agriculture had made him a target, and his family's divided life between Washington and Wyoming had created vulnerabilities that criminal organizations could exploit. The photograph proved that the threat extended far beyond the ranch's boundaries, potentially reaching into the heart of the nation's capital. Thomas immediately contacted Marshall Crawford, who had remained in federal service and was now based in Denver. Crawford's response was swift and decisive. Within hours, federal agents were deployed to protect the Garrett family's Washington residence, while a joint task force of territorial and federal law enforcement began investigating the new criminal network. What they discovered over the next week was a revenge operation orchestrated by surviving members of Harrison Blackwell's criminal empire. Led by Blackwell's younger brother Marcus, who had been studying law in Chicago during the original investigation, the new organization had spent 5 years planning a systematic campaign against everyone who had contributed to the destruction of the family's criminal legacy. Marcus Blackwell had proven to be even more dangerous than his older brother, combining the family's criminal instincts with a sophisticated understanding of legal and political systems. He had used legitimate business investments to build a network of contacts and resources, creating what appeared to be a respectable financial empire, while secretly organizing criminal operations designed to eliminate his brother's enemies one by one. The revelation transformed Thomas's return to Wyoming from a family emergency into a federal investigation of national significance. His unique position as both a target and a federal official created unprecedented challenges for law enforcement agencies, trying to protect him while building a case against the Blackwell organization. The investigation also revealed the true scope of Marcus Blackwell's ambitions. Beyond simple revenge, he intended to use his brother's criminal network as the foundation for a much larger operation that would control agricultural commerce across the entire western region. Thomas's influence over federal agricultural policy made him both a threat to these plans and a valuable target for elimination or coercion. The final confrontation came not through dramatic shootouts or chase scenes, but through the patient application of federal law enforcement resources and Thomas's own detailed knowledge of criminal operations. Working closely with Crawford and a team of federal investigators, Thomas helped identify the financial networks that supported Marcus Blackwell's organization, tracing money flows and communication patterns that revealed the full extent of the Culvequan criminal conspiracy. The breakthrough came when federal agents arrested one of Blackwell's key lieutenants during a routine banking transaction in Denver. Under interrogation, the man revealed the location of the organization's main headquarters, a seemingly legitimate cattle brokerage operation that served as a front for coordinating thefts across 3 states. The raid on the headquarters was swift and decisive. Marcus Blackwell was captured along with detailed records that documented years of criminal planning and provided evidence for prosecuting dozens of associates across the region. Most importantly, the raid eliminated the immediate threat to the Garrett family while dismantling a criminal organization that could have devastated the Western agricultural economy. But the victory came with profound personal costs for Thomas and his family. The stress of the investigation, combined with the demands of his federal position, had taken a severe toll on his health. At 47, he looked decades older, his hair completely gray and his face lined with the weight of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. The family's divided life between Washington and Wyoming had also created strains that threatened their fundamental unity. The children had grown increasingly resentful of the constant moves and disruptions, while Elizabeth struggled to maintain any sense of normalcy in their domestic life. The wealth and prestige that had once seemed like such remarkable blessings now felt like burdens that isolated them from the simple pleasures they had once cherished. It was during the aftermath of the Blackwell investigation that Thomas made the decision that would define the final chapter of his public career. In a letter to President Harrison, he announced his resignation from the position of Secretary of Agriculture, effective at the end of his current term. The resignation surprised political observers across the nation, many of whom had expected Thomas to use his success in the criminal investigation as a stepping stone to even higher office. But Thomas had come to understand that his true calling lay not in the corridors of political power, but in the land and community that had shaped his character and values. The return to full-time ranch life was both a relief and a challenge. After years of operating on a national stage, Thomas had to readjust to the rhythms and concerns of local agricultural life. But he also discovered that his experiences in Washington had given him new perspectives and skills that could benefit the ranching community in unexpected ways. Working with Samuel and Marcus Thornfield, Thomas began implementing innovations in ranch management and agricultural technology that had been inspired by his federal service. The ranch became a testing ground for new breeding techniques, soil conservation methods, and cooperative marketing strategies that would eventually spread throughout the Western agricultural community. Perhaps more importantly, Thomas used his national reputation and political connections to advocate for rural interests from outside the government system. His speeches and writings about agricultural policy became influential voices in national debates, while his testimony before congressional committees carried the weight of both practical experience and federal service. The Garrett family story reached its natural conclusion, not with dramatic events or sudden transformations, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and responsibilities faithfully discharged. Thomas and Elizabeth watched their children grow into successful adults who carried forward the values and lessons learned during their family's remarkable journey from poverty to prosperity. Samuel eventually assumed full control of the ranch operations, proving himself to be an even more innovative manager than his father. Mary married well and used her social position to advocate for women's education and rural development programs. The twins both graduated from Yale and returned west to pursue careers in engineering and scientific research that contributed to the region's continued growth and development. Even little Emma, now a confident young woman, found her own path as an educator who established schools for immigrant families and rural communities throughout the territory. As Thomas entered his 60s, he often reflected on the remarkable series of events that had transformed his family from desperate debtors at a courthouse auction into one of the most respected and influential families in the American West. The journey had tested every aspect of their character and values, but it had also revealed strengths and possibilities they had never imagined. The debt that had once threatened to destroy them had become the catalyst for achievements that exceeded their wildest dreams. The stranger who had purchased their labor had become not just a business partner but a lifelong friend who had helped them discover their own potential. And the harsh land that had initially seemed so unforgiving had rewarded their persistence and courage with opportunities that would benefit generations to come. Standing on his porch on a clear evening in 1900, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Thomas Garrett understood that his story was more than just a personal tale of triumph over adversity. It was a testament to the transformative power of courage, integrity, and human kindness, proof that in America, especially in the vast possibilities of the West, any family willing to face the future with hope and determination could build a legacy that would outlast their own brief time on earth. The auctioneer's gavel that had once threatened to scatter his family to the winds had instead set in motion a series of events that would make them pillars of their community and examples of what was possible when good people refused to surrender to despair. Their story would be remembered not just in the annals of Wyoming history, but in the larger narrative of American opportunity and resilience that continued to inspire families facing their own challenges in an ever-changing world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from U.S.